The new girl in the music room. The school's music room smelled faintly of polished wood and old sheet music. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting soft golden patterns on the floor. Students were scattered around, unpacking. Shiny instruments from neat cases, polished trumpets, freshly tuned guitars, violins with smooth, perfect strings, and then the door opened slowly. A girl stepped inside, holding a violin case that looked older than the room itself. Its corners were worn, the handle wrapped with faded tape. She walked quietly, her steps almost soundless against the wooden floor. Her eyes scanned the room, then lowered to the ground. A few students looked up from their instruments and exchanged quick glances. They didn't say her name, but their voices were low enough. "To Carrie, she can't play," one whispered. "She's probably just here to watch." Another replied with a small laugh. The girl didn't react. She moved to an empty chair in the back of the room, placing the case gently on her lap. The music teacher, a woman with kind eyes but a firm voice, greeted her with a polite nod. "Welcome. You can sit there for now," she said. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either, the kind of voice teachers use when they aren't sure what to expect. Around her, the other students tuned their instruments, air filling with random notes and half-played melodies. The girl opened her case slowly, as if worried the hinges might creak. Inside lay a violin with a few scratches across its surface. The wood was a deep brown, not the bright shine of the others. Her bow was slightly frayed at the edges, the strings not new, but carefully tightened. She ran her fingers along the violin's neck like it was something fragile. The teacher called the students to order. "All right, everyone. We're going to go through the performance list today," she announced. Names were read out one by one, each student standing to play a short piece. When the first few played, their friends clapped softly. Some performances were smooth, others a little shaky, but all were met with nods from the teacher. The girl sat in silence, her hands resting on her violin. Every now and then, she could still hear a whisper from the other side of the room. "She's not even holding it right. She's probably going to play one note and stop." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Then the teacher looked down at the list. Her eyes paused, and she read the girl's name. "You're up," she said. The girl's heart thudded in her chest. She rose slowly, walking toward the front of the room. A soft creak under her shoes. She could feel all the eyes on her, some curious, some already expecting her to fail. She stood before the class, violin in one hand, bow in the other. For a moment, she looked at the teacher, who gave a small, encouraging nod. Her hands felt cold, her grip tight. She adjusted the violin under her chin. The room went still, the faint hum of the overhead lights suddenly noticeable. She drew a slow breath, trying to calm the rush of thoughts in her head. The girl thought of the evenings she had practiced alone in her small room, how her father had saved for months to buy this violin from a second-hand shop. She remembered the sound of the rain against the window while she learned each note. Her first attempt at this piece had been clumsy, but she had played it again and again until her fingers moved without thinking, and now she was here. In a room full of strangers, someone in the back coughed, breaking her thoughts. The girl lifted the bow and placed it gently on the strings. She didn't start playing. Just yet. She waited a second longer. The whispers had stopped now, the silence heavier than before. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. One deep breath, and she was ready. The teacher's eyes softened, sensing the nervousness in her stance. The girl's shoulders relaxed slightly, her fingers curling into their familiar positions. She let the bow rest there for another moment. The first note was only seconds away, and though she didn't know it yet, what happened next would change every whisper in that room. The weight of their words. The bow was still resting on the strings. The girl's hands trembled, but her fingers knew where to go. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to hide, but to listen to the quiet air, the faint breathing of her classmates, the way the room seemed to lean in closer. Then she began. The first note came out soft, almost too soft, like a whisper, but it was steady. Her bow moved slowly, drawing out the sound as if she was telling the first sentence of a story. The other students, who had been ready to smirk or roll their eyes, stayed still, Even the teacher tilted her head slightly, her expression changing. The girl's hands stopped shaking. She found the rhythm she knew so well from all those nights of practice. Her fingers pressed the strings with care, moving with a memory that went deeper than thought. The sound wasn't perfect. One note slid a little high, but it carried something real. It was the kind of sound that made you want to keep listening. In the back, a boy who had whispered earlier shifted in his seat. He glanced at his friend, who didn't meet his eyes. The room wasn't filled with whispers anymore, only with the voice of the violin. Each note seemed to fill the space between the desks, wrapping around the listeners like a thread, pulling them closer. The girl's thoughts drifted for a moment. She wasn't in the music room anymore. She was back in her small home, sitting by the window with the rain tapping softly on the glass. Her father was in the kitchen, cooking something warm while humming quietly to himself. That was the night she first played this song from start to finish without stopping. She remembered the way she smiled to herself. No one there to see it. She opened her eyes again, and the music room came back into view. Every face was turned toward her. Some leaned forward slightly. Others sat still, but none looked bored. It was a strange feeling. The same people who had doubted her now, waiting for her next note. Her bow moved faster, her fingers pressing with more certainty. The melody began to rise, no longer just soft and careful, but reaching for something brighter. The teacher's lips curved into a small smile. It wasn't a smile of surprise anymore, but one of recognition, the kind a person gives when they see real talent. The assistant teacher, who had been sorting sheet music, stopped and turned fully toward the girl. Even the faint hum of the old heater in the corner seemed quieter, as if the room itself was listening. She played the part of the melody that always made her chest tighten. It was a high note that seemed to hang in the air before falling into a gentler phrase. Her bow glided smoothly, and for a moment she felt completely in control. She didn't think about mistakes or judgment. She thought about the sound, the way it seemed to speak for her better than her own voice ever could. Her classmates didn't say anything, but their faces told the story. One girl who had been looking at her phone earlier now held it in her lap, forgotten. A boy in the second row leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, just listening. Even the ones who didn't care about music were caught in the way she played. It wasn't about the violin anymore. It was about the feeling that came through it. The girl knew she didn't own the best instrument. She knew her bow wasn't new, and her case looked worn, but right now none of that mattered. The sound was hers, and she was giving it to this room. Every note was a piece of her story. The nights she stayed up practicing until her fingers ached, the mornings she woke early to play before school, the times she played just to feel less alone. She came to the softest part of the song, where the bow barely touched the strings. The sound was so delicate that you had to lean in to catch it. This was the part she had practiced most. It was easy to play it loud, but it was harder to play it quiet, to let the silence in between become part of the music. And she did it exactly the way she wanted when the last note of that section faded. The room didn't breathe for a second. The teacher gave a tiny nod, her eyes meeting the girl's. The nod wasn't for show. It was an unspoken "I hear you." The girl's heart swelled a little, but she didn't break focus. She still had the final part to play, the part that would either finish strong or fall apart. Her bow pressed firmly to the strings again. The melody picked up, brighter now, flowing like a stream in sunlight. Her hands no longer felt cold. They felt alive. Every movement was sure, every shift of her fingers smooth. She was no longer just the new girl with an old violin. She was someone worth listening to, and in that moment, the whispers that had started when she walked into the room no longer existed. There was only the music and the quiet, unexpected respect beginning to grow in the hearts of everyone listening. The first note that changed everything. The girl held her breath as the final note of her last section faded. It hung in the air for a moment, thin and delicate, like a feather drifting down. She lowered her bow slightly, thinking she had reached the end. But the teacher's voice came gently from the front. "Keep going. Play the rest," she said. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. The girl nodded slowly, adjusted her grip, and began again. This time the music felt different. She was no longer playing just to prove herself. She was playing because she wanted to, because the sound itself felt like it belonged to her. The melody picked up in pace. Her fingers moved across the strings with quick, precise steps. Every shift was smooth, every note alive. She wasn't thinking about the other students anymore. She wasn't thinking about whether they liked her or not. She was only thinking about the way each note seemed to connect to the next. The students sat quietly, their earlier curiosity now replaced with focus. Some had their eyes fixed on her hands, watching the way her fingers danced over the strings. Others leaned back with closed eyes, letting the music draw pictures in their minds. A boy in the corner tapped his foot softly. Trying not to be noticed, the teacher crossed her arms, her face thoughtful but warm. The girl's bow pressed harder on the strings as she entered the strongest part of the song. The sound filled the room like sunlight spilling through a window. It was no longer a shy, careful melody. It was confident, almost bold. She could feel it in her chest. The vibrations from the violin traveled through her hands, into her arms, and all the way to her heart. She thought again of the time she had played this song at home late at night. When the streets outside were quiet, she would sit on the edge of her bed, the dim light from the lamp falling across the violin. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine she was playing in a great hall, not for fame, but for the people who would listen and understand without needing to say anything. Her father had once told her, "Music doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest." She didn't fully understand it then, but she did now. Every note she played was honest. It carried her mistakes, her hope, her love for this simple piece of wood and strings. The assistant teacher leaned toward the main teacher and whispered something. The main teacher didn't reply. She was too busy listening. It wasn't often that a student made her stop thinking about technique and focus only on the feeling. But this girl had done it without even realizing. The song slowed, drifting into the softer section again. This part was almost like a conversation with silence. Her bow barely touched the strings, and yet the sound was still clear. The quietest notes often spoke the loudest, and in that room, it felt like everyone was leaning in to hear them. Her classmates' faces had changed. They no longer looked like they were waiting for her to fail. They looked like they were hoping the song wouldn't end too soon. One girl in the front row bit her lip, trying to hide a small smile. A boy who had been leaning back earlier now sat forward, his elbows resting on his knees. They didn't know it, but their expressions told her she had already won something important. The final section approached, the ending she had practiced more times than she could count. It was the part she had stumbled over in the beginning, but now her fingers were sure. The bow moved fast, drawing a bright, full sound from the violin. The melody rose higher and higher, then fell gently into a last soft note. That note stayed in the air, refusing to disappear, and when it finally did, the room was completely still. For a long moment, no one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't want to break the moment. It was the kind of silence that only comes when everyone has felt the same thing at the same time. Then the teacher began to clap slowly at first, and the sound grew. One by one, the students joined in. It wasn't loud applause, but it was warm and real. The girl lowered her violin and gave a small nod. She didn't smile yet. She was still catching her breath. The teacher stepped forward. That she said softly was beautiful. It was only 3 words, but they held more weight than the whispers she had heard earlier. The girl walked back to her seat, her steps steady now. She placed the violin back in its worn case, running her fingers over the scratches like they were part of its story. The whispers didn't return. Instead, there was a quiet respect that filled the space they had left behind. The room changes. The music room didn't feel the same after she sat down. It was as if the air had shifted. Lighter somehow, the teacher was still watching her, not in the way a teacher watches a student, but in the way someone watches a story they didn't expect to see. The assistant teacher gave a small nod to himself before returning to his papers. Though his eyes kept drifting back to her, the next student's name was called. A boy with a brand new violin walked to the front. His instrument shone under the light, the wood flawless. He played clean. Quick notes, everyone correct, but the room didn't feel the same as when she had played. It was skill without the weight of a story. People clapped politely when he finished. But the sound faded quickly. The girl sat quietly in the back, her hands folded on her lap. She didn't search for their approval anymore. Something had already shifted, not just in them, but in her. Her heart was still beating fast, but not from fear, from the memory of what had just happened. She could still feel the last note in her fingertips. She knew she had given them more than they expected. 2 students in front of her whispered. "But it wasn't like before. She's actually really good," one said. "Better than I thought," the other replied. The words reached her. And this time, they didn't sting. They were softer, almost uncertain. Like the start of respect, when class ended, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room. Students began packing their instruments, chatting about the next performance, the teacher called out. "Don't forget, the school concert is next month, and everyone will play a solo." A small wave of nervous laughter moved through the class. For some, it was just another task. For her, it was a door she hadn't expected to open. As she closed her violin case, she noticed one of the boys who had whispered earlier looking at her. He hesitated, then said, "Hey, nice playing." It was short, almost awkward, but it was real. She gave a small nod. "Thanks," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. The boy looked like he wanted to say more, but the moment passed, and he left with his friends. The teacher walked over, her footsteps slow and measured. "You've been playing for how long?" she asked. The girl hesitated, unsure if she should tell the truth. 2 years, she said softly. The teacher raised her eyebrows. 2 years? That's impressive. There was no disbelief in her tone. Only a kind of surprise, mixed with curiosity. "Keep practicing," she added. "You have something worth sharing." It was simple advice, but it stayed with her when she stepped. Outside, the air was crisp. The late afternoon sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. She walked home with her violin case in one hand, her steps slower than usual, not because she was tired, but because she didn't want to lose the feeling that still lingered. The whispers from earlier felt far away now. What stayed close was the sound of her own music filling the room. It was the first time she believed, deep down, that she belonged there. That evening, at home, she placed the violin on her bed and sat beside it. Her father peeked into her room, still wearing his work jacket. "How was it?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then simply said, "It went well." He smiled. "I knew it would," and walked away. But she could tell from the way his steps slowed in the hallway that he was proud. She picked up the violin. Again, not to practice, but to play the song one more time. The room was quiet, except for her. The notes didn't need an audience tonight. They were just for her. She thought about the concert next month. A part of her felt nervous, but a bigger part felt ready. She knew it wouldn't be perfect. But she also knew perfection wasn't what people remembered. They remembered how something made them feel, back in the music room. Her empty chair still sat in the corner. Tomorrow, she would walk in again, still the new girl to some. But she wouldn't be carrying just an old violin case. She'd be carrying the memory of a moment when the whispers stopped and the music spoke louder than anything else. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The change in the whispers, the last note faded slowly. It seemed to hang in the air like a thread of light. The girl let her bow fall gently to her side. She didn't move, didn't speak. The gymnasium was so still that she could hear the faint hum of the stage lights above, and then the sound of hands coming together. At first it was just one pair, steady and deliberate, then another joined in, and another, until the clapping became a warm wave that filled the entire space. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of applause that came from people who had truly felt something. She bowed her head slightly, her eyes finding her father in the third row. He wasn't clapping yet. Instead, he sat completely still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes shining. When he finally brought his hands together, the sound was slow, almost careful, like he was applauding not just the music, but everything that had led to this moment. She walked off the stage quietly, her heart still racing. Backstage, a few students were waiting. One of them, the boy who had once whispered she couldn't play, stepped forward. "That was really good," he said, his voice low but sincere. She gave a small smile. "Thanks," she replied. The words weren't dramatic, but they were honest, and that was enough. As the concert continued, she sat among the other performers, but her thoughts kept returning to that silence just before the applause. It was the same kind of silence she had heard the first time she played in the music room, only now it had happened in front of an entire gym full of people. When the last student finished and the teacher came on stage to thank the audience, she made a point to mention the courage it took for each performer to share their music. Her eyes lingered on the girl for just a moment longer. No words were spoken, but the message was clear after the concert. The gym became a swirl of voices, laughter, and footsteps. Parents congratulated their children. Students swapped stories about their performances. The girl was standing near the back, holding her violin case close. She didn't expect anyone to come to her. She never did. But one by one, people began stopping. A woman she didn't recognize smiled warmly. "You play beautifully, dear," she said. "I could feel every note." Another parent leaned down to say, "My son told me you were amazing in class too." Even a younger student from the school's beginner music group approached shyly. "Can you teach me how to make my note sound like that?" he asked. She felt her cheeks warm. "It just takes practice," she said softly. "And playing from here," she added, tapping her chest. Her father walked over, his steps unhurried, when he reached her. He didn't say anything at first. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder. "You played for her tonight," he said quietly. The girl nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. "I think she would have been proud," he added. Her throat tightened, but she managed a small, "I hope so," on Monday, when she walked into the music room again. The air felt lighter. No one turned to whisper. Instead, a couple of students smiled or raised their hands in a small wave. One girl called from across the room, "Hey, we saved you a seat." It wasn't a big moment, but it was one that told her everything had changed. During rehearsal, the teacher asked the class to play together. As they tuned their instruments, she noticed something. The glances toward her were no longer curious or doubtful. They were expectant. It was as if they wanted to hear her again, and when they played as a group, she felt something new. She wasn't just playing with them, she was playing among them. She belonged here now after class, as she packed her violin. The boy who had once teased her the most stopped by her desk. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "You're really good." It was awkward, almost clumsy, but she could tell he meant it. "Thanks," she said simply. He hesitated, then added, "You should try for the county music program next year. You'd get in for sure." She didn't answer right away, but the thought stayed with her. That afternoon, she walked home under a pale winter sun. The streets were quiet except for the sound of her shoes against the pavement. She thought about how different things felt now compared to that first day. Back then, the whispers had followed her like a shadow now. The only sound that followed her was the memory of applause. She knew she would face other challenges. There would still be times when people underestimated her. But she also knew something she hadn't known before, that the moment you let the music speak for you, the right people will always listen. And from that day on, when people spoke about her, it wasn't to say she can't play. It was to say, "Have you heard her play?" The memory that stayed years past. But that night in the gymnasium never faded from her memory, not because of the clapping or the compliments, or the way her classmates had looked at her afterward, but because of the silence just before the applause, that moment when the last note had floated in the air and everyone had been completely still. It was the first time she realized her music could make people feel something. She went on to play in the county program, then in the state ensemble. Her violin case still had the same worn handle, though she had replaced the old strings many times. It didn't matter how polished the instruments around her were. She carried the same one her father had bought from the second-hand shop. It wasn't just an instrument. It was part of her story. Every time she stepped onto a stage, she remembered that first day in the music room, how she had walked in quietly, how the whispers had followed her, how her hands had shaken, and how everything had changed when the music began. She learned something important from those early days, that people often see only what's in front of them. They see the old case, the frayed bow, the quiet girl in the corner. They don't see the late nights, the practice in a small room, the reason why a song matters. till you show them. Years later, she was invited back to her old school to watch. The annual concert, the music room hadn't changed much. The same tall windows let the sunlight in, the same wooden floor creaked underfoot. But the faces were new, students she didn't know, carrying shiny instruments in bright cases. She sat in the back quietly when the first student stepped onto the stage. She noticed a small girl sitting in the corner of the room. The girl's violin case was old, the strap patched with tape. Her eyes were downcast. Her hands folded tightly together, and just like that, she saw herself all over again. When it was the small girl's turn to play, a few whispers passed through. The Rose, the woman now older, with years of music behind her, leaned forward slightly. She listened carefully, not to judge, but to hear. The girl lifted her bow and began to play. The first notes were shaky, but there was something in them, something that pulled the listener in. When the performance ended, the clapping was polite. But the woman stood and joined in with a louder, steadier applause. She knew how much that could matter later. She found the girl in the hallway. "You played beautifully," she said. The small girl looked up, surprised. "Really?" she asked, almost as if she had never heard it before. "Really?" the woman said with a warm smile. "Don't stop playing ever." Walking out of the school that day, realized how full the circle had become once. She had been the quiet girl in the corner. Now, she was the one who could change a whisper with a few kind words. At home that night, she opened her violin case. The familiar weight of the instrument settled into her hands. She sat by the window, just like she used to, outside. The streetlights glowed against the evening sky. She lifted the bow and began to play the same melody she had played for her mother years ago. The sound filled the small room. It carried every memory, the rain on the glass, her father listening from the kitchen, the first time the music room went silent, the applause in the gymnasium, and now, the look on the young girl's face when she told her to keep going. She didn't need an audience anymore. She didn't need approval. The music itself was enough. But she also knew that somewhere, someone would hear it, and maybe for them, it would change everything. Because the truth she had learned was simple. The smallest songs can hold the biggest stories. And sometimes all it takes to change a whisper is a single note played with your whole heart. The hidden story: the days after that first performance passed quietly. The girl kept her place in the back of the music room, still arriving early, still carrying the same old violin case. But now, the glances she got were different. Some students gave her a small nod when she walked in. Others didn't speak, but no longer looked at her with doubt. One afternoon, the teacher asked everyone to bring a piece of music that meant something personal. It didn't have to be famous. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to matter. The girl knew immediately which song she would bring. It was the same melody she had played that first day, but this time, she would tell them where it came. From when the class began, students took turns sharing their pieces. Some played upbeat tunes that made their friends laugh. Others played songs they had learned for competitions. The teacher smiled at each one, offering small tips or encouragement. When it was her turn, the room went quiet. She stood slowly, walking to the front with her violin in hand, before she played. She looked at the faces around her, faces that once only whispered, "Waiting." "This song," she began softly, "is the first one I learned all the way through." Her voice was steady, but her hands felt warm around the neck of the violin. "My mother used to hum it in the evenings," she continued. Before she passed away, there was no drama in her tone, just truth." A few students shifted in their seats. "The air heavier now. She never played an instrument. But she liked this tune," the girl said. "When I started learning the violin, I wanted to play it for her. But I never got the chance." She paused. "Not to be dramatic, but to take a breath. So now, I play it for her." Every time, she didn't wait for a reaction. She raised the violin to her chin and began. The first note was the same as before, soft, careful, but the meaning felt stronger. The sound filled the space between the desks. Some students leaned forward without even realizing it. The boy in the back, who once made jokes, rested his chin on his hand, listening quietly. Her bow moved with a mix of control and emotion. She wasn't just playing the melody, she was speaking through it. Every shift in the notes felt like a memory, She thought of her mother humming while folding laundry, of rainy evenings when the small apartment felt warm just because of her voice. She didn't need to force the feeling into the music, it was already there. Halfway through, her eyes blurred, but she didn't stop. She had played this song so many times in her room, but here with the class listening, it felt different. It felt like she was letting them see a piece of herself she had kept hidden. The teacher's eyes were softer now. She didn't interrupt. Didn't write notes on her clipboard. She simply stood still, hands clasped. The assistant teacher didn't look down at his papers once. It was as if the whole room knew this wasn't just another school performance. When the last note faded, there was a pause. A longer pause than before. No one clapped right away. The girl lowered her violin, her heart beating fast. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was the teacher. The rest followed, but the sound wasn't loud, it was slow. Steady and full of meaning. That, the teacher said gently, is why music exists. The girl didn't smile, but she felt something in her chest loosen for the first time. She believed the song had reached someone other than herself after class. A few students came to her desk. One girl said quietly, "That was beautiful." Another asked, "Can you teach me that song?" The questions weren't about her skill anymore. They were about the feeling. And that was what she had wanted all along. When she left school that day, the air outside was cool and fresh. She walked home slowly, her violin case swinging gently. At her side, she thought about how her mother used to say, "The smallest songs can hold the biggest memories." She had never understood it until now. The whispers that once followed her into the room had been replaced by something quieter but stronger: respect. And she knew, deep down, that when the school concert came, she would be ready. The last note before the concert, the weeks before the school concert, passed faster than she expected. Every music class now felt different. She wasn't invisible anymore when she walked in. Students made space for her to sit. Sometimes they even asked for her opinion on their playing. She didn't always know what to say, but she tried. The whispers were gone, replaced by quiet glances that carried something like respect. The teacher had given each student their solo piece for the concert. When she handed the girl her sheet music, she said, "I want you to play the song you played." "For your mother?" The girl blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" she asked. The teacher smiled. "Yes, but this time, make it even more yours." Those words stayed in her mind. She knew what they meant. It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. She practiced every evening, sometimes in her room with the window open, letting the cool night air in, sometimes in the small living room, while her father read the newspaper. He never said much while she played, but once she caught him closing his eyes and just listening. That small moment meant more than any compliment. One afternoon, after class, the teacher pulled her aside. "You have something rare," she said quietly. "It's not just skill, it's the way you make people feel." The girl didn't know how to answer, so she just nodded. She wasn't used to praise, and part of her still didn't believe it fully as the concert date came closer. The school's halls were filled with the sound of rehearsals. The gymnasium, where the concert would be held, was being set up with rows of folding chairs and a stage. Students practiced in small groups, running through their pieces until their fingers ached. She preferred to practice alone in the music room when no one was around. The quiet helped her focus. Here, she could play the opening note again and again until it sounded just right. One day, she was practicing when the door opened. It was one of the boys who had whispered about her that first day. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I just wanted to say good luck for the concert," he said. She was surprised, but she smiled a little. "Thanks," she replied. He nodded once and left. It wasn't much, but it felt like another piece of the old wall between them had crumbled. The night before the concert, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her mind kept replaying the first time she had played in the music room, the whispers, the stares, the way her hands had shaken. Tomorrow, she would walk onto a much bigger stage, but this time, she wasn't just the new girl anymore. The morning of the concert was cold but clear. She dressed carefully, wearing a simple black dress her father had bought just for the performance. It wasn't fancy, but it made her feel ready. Her father handed her the violin case and said, Play like you're talking to her." She didn't need to ask who he meant when she arrived at the school. The gym was already buzzing with people. Parents, friends, and teachers filled the chairs. Some students paced backstage, nervously practicing their pieces one last time. She found a quiet corner and tightened her bow, checking the strings. Her heart was beating fast, but it wasn't the same kind of fear as before. It was energy. She knew the song inside out. The only thing left was to play it the way it was meant to be played. One by one, students went on stage. Some played upbeat tunes that made the audience clap along. Others played slow, graceful pieces that drew quiet admiration when her name was called. She took a deep breath. She stepped onto the stage. The bright lights making the crowd a blur. She could just make out her father sitting in the third row, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on her. She placed the violin under her chin. The bow rested against the strings. She closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she saw her mother sitting in the front row, smiling when she opened her eyes again. The nerves were gone. She was ready. The first note rang out clear and warm. And just like that, the gym was silent, except for her. The sound carried not just across the room, but into the hearts of everyone listening. She didn't think about the size of the audience or the bright lights. She thought about the evenings in her small room, the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen, the hum of her mother's voice. She played as if each note was a piece of that memory. The melody rose and fell, soft at times, strong at others, and as she played, she felt the same shift she had felt in the music room weeks ago. People weren't just hearing her, they were feeling her. When she reached the final section, her bow moved with complete certainty. The note held just long enough before fading, and in that moment, she knew this performance was more than music. It was a message one only she could give.